We're on chapter 8, page 69 in the printed copy. Chapter title says April of 1959. So wait, is April of 1959, is that a full 6 months later for her? September of 58, so October, November, December. Yeah, so that should be the 6 month mark, right? Or the end of the 6 months, beginning of the 7th. Let's see what the story has to say. Here we go. I sat on the bank of the River Nen, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. God, it was so good to have the warmth on me. The watery sunlight had a strangeness to it today, as if an immense veil covered the firmament, filtering the sun's warm rays. I'd never get used to the cool April weather. Today's outing had been Ornella's idea, and she made a good choice. It was beautiful and peaceful on the riverbank in Peterborough. Not overcrowded, simply enough people to bring a friendly atmosphere. Only a 40-minute bus ride from Long Sutton. I lay back on the grass, my warm coat protecting me from the damp. A parade of sweet fragrances floated up my nose from the spring air. I'd forgotten what it was like to be out in the open countryside. 10 months had passed since my arrival in England. What had begun as a 6-month work permit had turned into almost a year. The manager needed good, reliable staff, and Gulia had put my name forward. I worked hard, and they could count on me. They could count on Florinda too. When Christmas had arrived, I'd been asked if I wanted to renew my contract. At first, I'd hesitated. Mama needed me, even more so now that both her girls had left home. If I stayed for another 6 months, Florinda would follow suit. And she had. We'd talked together for days and days about staying on. In the end, we both agreed to renew our contracts. Florinda had rightly stated that if we returned to Italy, we'd never come back to England. Our lives would resume as before, and neither of us wanted that. We'd marry, have children, and England would become a distant memory. Now that we'd had a taste of freedom, we wanted more. And I still had other things to achieve, but that I kept to myself. My only regret had been Anna's departure. Her mother needed her. I didn't believe that. If Anna had wanted to remain in England, nothing would have stopped her. The determined girl who had persuaded me to leave Italy for a bit of adventure had quickly become homesick. Her mother's plea for her daughter to return home had suited Anna fine. Although she'd been ashamed to admit it, I'd guessed the real reason. Christ, how I missed her. With my hands shoved deep into my pockets, I stared upwards into the immense blue, listening to the light wind tease the leaves in the trees. Florinda and Ornella talked nearby, organizing the weekend to come. Puffy cotton clouds transformed themselves into different shapes, and through half-closed eyes, I let the chirping of a nearby bird carry me upwards. A few moments later, the sky disappeared into a woolen blanket of motley grey. I turned my head and inspected my surroundings. The greenish shades of the countryside had subdued to flatness. Now and again, rays of light danced like a ballerina across the water, and the river mirrored the sky above, both of them menacing anthracite. I sat up, smiled at my two companions, and whipped out my sketch pad. The breeze blew my hair out of my face as my crayon skimmed across the paper. Before I knew it, thanks to the changing tones of the sky, I'd managed to come up with 2 different sketches of spring dresses in colors of bobbing on the lake. Turning to face the hills behind me, I designed a couple more outfits. Using the different shades the sun had formed on the trees, I sketched a wide flowing skirt, imagining bands of different green silks and tightly pleated from the waist to above the knee hem. Loud shouting forced me to peer over my shoulder. I gazed across the river where two men waved from a small motorboat. Were they calling out to us? Snapping my pad shut, I shoved it into my bag with my pencil case. "What's he saying?" I asked Ornella. "He wants to know if you want to go for a ride." My eyes widened. This was the first time a man wanted to speak to me without going through my brother. Ornella nudged me. "Well, what do I tell them?" The river looked calm enough, and the bank descended gently down to the water, but I'd never been allowed to be friends with men. I gazed around, expecting Vittorio to pop up any minute. "Your brother isn't here," Ornella said, reading my mind. "Hurry up before he changes his mind. What do I tell him?" I nodded, and Ornella waved them over. The boat chugged up to the bank and the two men jumped off. The tallest strode our way while the other wrapped the rope around his hand, keeping control of the vessel as it bobbed up and down on the water. I observed the stranger as he approached. Clean-shaven, determined long strides, and so tall. Dark hair stood on end, moving gently in the spring breeze. His coat was of the latest fashion for England. It had gone out of style in Italy at least 2 years ago. I knew what I was talking about. Behind him, his friend's hair was a perfect mop of ginger, taking on a hue of bronze when the sun peeked out from behind the clouds. I'd never seen anyone with that color hair before. Hadn't even known it existed. As the stranger stood in front of us, I had a better view. He appeared to be no older than 25. Mind you, looks could be deceiving. That said, there were no wrinkles around his eyes or on his forehead. He didn't have the typical arched Italian nose either. His lips had me mesmerized. I can read. He had the kind of mouth that asked to be kissed. The giant met my gaze with a determined refusal to look away first. Something in his dark eyes fascinated me. "What's your name?" he asked. Receiving no answer, he smiled before pointing to himself. "I'm James." The sound of his voice left me breathless, and I blushed. "Bianca? Nice name." I stared at Ornella and shook my head. "Che disse?" My friend grinned and winked at me. "Bel nome." My face heated up, and I must have turned an unbecoming shade of crimson. Not only did this man have a strange effect on me, but I hated not knowing what he said. On returning to the factory, I was going to learn English in record time. A warm flush crept through me. Could this be the final motivation I needed to learn the language? Although I kept promising myself to learn English to seek a job as a dress designer, I'd never got around to it. Not understanding what people said hadn't bothered me in the past. Not understanding this man did. I climbed into the boat and settled myself at the front, hoping I wouldn't embarrass myself by being sick. James took the rope from this friend and gave him a knowing wink, whatever that was supposed to mean. The other chap made a beeline for Florinda, and they both sank down to the grass. My sister was in her element, fluttering eyelids, rolling strands of hair around her finger. I chuckled deep inside. The cold air brought the natural fragrance of water to my face, and my hand slid over the river's surface. Sunlight played upon the tiny ripples as if inviting me to dive in. and I found a kind of serenity skimming across the river with the water running through my fingers. My mind relaxed, and I imagined what it would be like to go out with James. Our difference in height would make anyone laugh. He had to be at least 2 meters tall. I measured 1 meter, 52, and didn't even come up to his shoulders. What a pair we'd make. I shook my head. What made me so sure this man was interested in me? He appeared the quiet gentleman. His looks were not what I expected, though. In my books, Englishmen were blonde with pale blue eyes. James was the complete opposite. Raven black hair and mysterious cognac eyes. Now and again, I glanced at him steering at the back of the boat. I didn't want to stare, but my eyes kept flicking back to him, so still, so concentrated on his steering. Each time I peered over my shoulder, his eyes met mine, and heat rose to my face. Once in a while, he talked to Ornella, who responded with short, clipped sentences. It didn't look as if she wanted to give out a lot of information. "Tutto bene?" Ornella asked after a while. "Perfetto." 15 minutes later, James brought the boat to a gradual halt, not far from when we left Florinda on the bank with the other chap. My sister hadn't been afraid to stay alone with a stranger. Why should she? There was no one to spy on her and report back to Papa. "Take my hand," James said. The expression in his voice was gentle as he extended his hand to help me out of the boat. I took a step forward, lost my balance as the vessel rocked, and before I had the chance to steady myself, he'd grabbed my hand and was gazing up, I can read, was gazing up into 2 beautiful irises. The man towered over me, far too tall for my liking. Butterflies stirred in the pit of my stomach as I tried to withdraw my hand. He released his hold a little, but didn't let go, and fierce tingles shot up my arm. Christ almighty. The man had a strange effect on me. James turned to Ornella. "And we meet up again. I'd like to take you up to visit the sights in London." Ornella translated. I remained silent. It was 2.5 hours from Long Sutton to London. What were the odds of us meeting up again? Did I want to meet him again? I shrugged and wandered over to my sister. Time to go if we didn't want to miss the bus. I looked over my shoulder. Ornella talked and laughed with James and his friend. Lucky woman. She spoke the language and was enjoying herself. So did James, for that matter. "What do you think?" Florinda asked once I caught up with her. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and followed her to the bus station. "Not for me." "What do you mean is not for you? Have you seen the way he devours you with his eyes? He's way too tall. Must have been stretched on one of those medieval torture racks." Florinda pulled her head back and let out a hearty laugh. Ornella looked around and came running up to us, a huge smile planted on her face. What was the woman up to? She seemed too smug for her own good. She'd been planning something. Something interesting and maybe a bit shady. I'd got used to her ways. Knew how her mind worked. I only hoped I was part of the plan. Quick break in the story. Time is moving on. A few days later, to my surprise and utter delight, I received a postcard from James. It came in the morning post. That same afternoon, I received another. James could have only gotten my address from Ornella. That's what she'd been scheming. With a huge smile, Ornella translated the few sentences. Apparently, James wanted to take me sightseeing in London. And the man was no fool. He knew I wouldn't go without a chaperone, so he'd invited Ornella and my sister. I placed the 2 postcards in my vanity case, out of sight. Even though everyone in the flat had picked up what Ornella had translated, the cards were still private. Ornella came rushing into the flat the next day, rolling her eyes. "You've got another one. I swear the man's smitten with you." Florinda grabbed the postcard and danced around the flat, waving it in the air, blowing loud kisses. I'd sort her out later. This was private stuff. I'd have to tell James to put the cards in envelopes. The whole factory didn't need to know what was going on. With Ornella's help, I replied, explaining that we'd planned to come to London later that month, and if things went to plan, we might meet up. The next afternoon, I received yet another postcard to say he'd be honored to be our guide. Our excitement echoed in the flat, and we discussed the places we wanted to visit, the things we intended to do. I drew up a list of things I wanted to see: Buckingham Palace, London Bridge, and Piccadilly Circus. In fact, I'd visit anything. Before leaving, though, we had to organize somewhere to stay. We'd been given permission to leave the factory. Ornella, with the manager's help, had reserved rooms with the nuns at the St. Mary's Convent in Chiswick. I would have preferred to be in the centre of London, but the manager had gone to a lot of trouble to organize things. I didn't want to complain and end up not going. I only hoped James would agree to pick us up at the convent. 3 weeks later, I stood outside the convent gazing up at the building made up of red bricks. We'd been told it dated from around 1896, but it appeared solid. For me, it was perfect. We'd been allowed to leave the factory quarters, we had somewhere to stay, and we were free to visit London. Besides, it was only for one night. We had a separate room each, if we could call it that, more like the size of a prison cell with enough room for a single bed, a chair, and a wooden writing desk. A huge cross hung over the head of the bed. No toilet or sink. The bathroom was further down the corridor. What had these walls seen? Heard, even? No coziness or warmth here, although a certain security flowed through the air. It was a holy place, saturated with prayer. How many women had stayed in this room, had slept in this bed, had added their prayers to the ones lingering here over the centuries? I gazed up to the cross and smiled. I'd added mine to the list later tonight. A knock at the door dragged my eyes away from the crucifix before Florinda and Ornella stepped inside. "You okay?" Ornella asked. "Everything's fine," I replied, catching the look of my sister's face. "It's only for one night, Florinda. Besides, you wanted to come." She didn't reply, but linked her arm through mine and led me out of the room and down the corridor. "Time to eat," she said. I raised my eyebrows. "I know," she continued. "The nuns eat early, like Mama's chickens." I stifled a giggle, and we ambled down the long corridor. The once polished wooden floor was now worn with years of people walking from their rooms to maybe the tiny chapel I'd noticed when we arrived. The refectory was large but bare with basic furniture. No ornate tapestries graced the walls. No rugs covered the floorboards. The long, sturdy oak table commanded the center of the room, its rainbow of browns stretching to the far end. 2 long benches of the same color lined either side of it. I sat and examined the table's surface. Each mark engraved in its pitted surface, a memory of the past. How many people had eaten here? in this exact spot where I sat. 2 young nuns came out of a door carrying white dishes. Had to be the kitchen. They placed the food in front of us and left. "What on earth is this?" I asked, prodding my fork at the food. "I have no idea," Florinda replied. She dipped her spoon into the brown sauce and slowly put it to her mouth. "Bah, it's awful." I didn't think it would be good. Looked like shoe polish. Warm shoe polish. Why didn't the English eat decent meals like pasta alla forno or tagliatella instead of soggy, overcooked vegetables and boiled meat? "You'll get used to it," Ornella said, taking big mouthfuls of the meat. "Never." Ornella winked at me. "You will." I managed to swallow a few morsels without gagging. Dessert was better. An apple. At least I could eat that. When we returned to the factory, I'd make stuffed peppers for everyone. Fry them with garlic and onions before letting them simmer in a succulent tomato sauce. My stomach grumbled at the sheer thought of it. Would grumble all night. As promised, James waited for us outside the convent the next morning, solitary and tall. I'd managed a piece of toast without marmalade for breakfast, despite the disgusting coffee. Hot colored water wasn't my idea of a good drink. Ornella called it instant coffee. Instant in what? Didn't the English grind their coffee beans to fill the percolator? The whole idea of making coffee was the pleasure of hearing the liquid bubble, not to mention the aroma which filled the kitchen. Never mind, another thing to do back at the factory tonight. The prospect of meeting up with James had killed my appetite, and any smell of food set my stomach churning. I felt sick and faint. How my legs kept going was a miracle. This was our first date, and I was too worried to relax. Worried about what he'd think of me. James stepped from the shadows of the building across the road, and my heart skipped a beat. I'd felt the chemistry from the start. In a few long strides, he'd stood in front of me, his fingers entwining mine. No words needed. His actions made up for the silence. "You look beautiful," he eventually said, eyeing me up and down. "Very elegant dress." Ornella translated, and a rush of heat flared across my chest and neck, no doubt making a horrible contrast against my ivory satin dress. I'd finished making it a few days back, thanks to one of the girls at the factory. She'd allowed me to use her sewing machine in exchange for a couple of my designs. She was an excellent seamstress, alas, with no idea how to design patterns. I helped her cut out the designs I'd sketched for her, and she let me use her machine. My olive skin accentuated the pale color of the material that hugged my body from the shoulders to the waist, before the pleated skirt flared from a slightly dropped waistline to above my knees. Light blue and green silks embroidered my short sleeves and hem, making it all the more eye-catching. Exactly what I was after. With a bit of luck, someone might notice it, especially in London. I pointed to my dress and said, "Mia creazione." James nodded, and, hand in hand, we headed down the road, Florinda and Ornella following, all eager to discover our sightseeing day. We spent the morning strolling around Hyde Park, a beautiful place where birds sang and squirrels darted from tree to tree. There were a few birds back home, but not as many as here, not when most of the men in the village were hunters. After a quick ham sandwich lunch, James helped us onto the special open-top sightseeing bus. The vehicle trundled through the streets of London, allowing the cool breeze to play with my hair. We didn't have buses like this at home, and it wouldn't be a bad idea. At least we'd be able to breathe the fresh air instead of garlic and sweat. We had a great view of the usual tourist sites, most of which I'd seen in my school books. Buckingham Palace, Tower Bridge, the Tower of London. When we approached the place called Hyde Park Barracks, James pointed to the building, then to himself. "You?" I said, pointing at him. Was he a Royal Horse Guard? He smiled and nodded. I looked back at the two guards on their horses, straight as posts, swords drawn, beautiful navy blue jackets, white trousers, long shiny cavalry boots, and red plumes on their helmets. I was impressed. Proud, even. James must look wonderful in uniform. The bus came to a stop and we scrambled off before turning into Piccadilly Circus. My feet froze to the ground. Where had all these pigeons come from? They outnumbered the cobblestones and tourists by far. If only Papa could see this. What a delighted hunter he'd be. What a perfect end to our visit. I'd come to London to sightsee, and James had been an excellent guide, and London was magic. Back outside the convent, we all stood in awkward silence. No one spoke. All eyes cast to the ground. James slipped his hands into his pockets. The embarrassing silence dragged on. Someone had to do something, take the initiative. That person turned out to be me. "Thank you," I said. James gave me a quick peck on the cheek. Ornella and Florinda looked away. I wasn't sure who was more embarrassed, me or them. The only person who hadn't turned scarlet was James. In fact, he looked extremely pleased with himself. "Can I take you out again?" he asked. When Ornella translated, I remained unsure of what to answer. Florinda pulled my arm and whispered, "Say yes. I want to visit other places in London." "It's rude to whisper," I hissed, tugging my arm free. "You're embarrassing all of us. What will James think?" He tilted his head to one side, waiting for my answer. And if I were honest with myself, another trip to London would be great. Although disappointed for not having the time to look around for fashion houses, I had turned quite a few heads. Return to the capital would give me the opportunity to search out boutiques and make another dress. The blue and grey silk one I designed when I'd first met James on the River Nen. Florinda opened her eyes wide at me as if to say, "Get on with it." Ornella had linked her arms with my sister, her fingers digging into Florinda's arm. It appeared they all waited for my decision. I eventually nodded, and everyone's face lit up. Later that evening, back at the factory, I ran myself a bath. Slipping under the hot water, I memorized my day, trying to figure out my emotions for James. He was a good-looking, decent man, and made me feel desirable and important. Was that enough? With hindsight, what did he see in a little, impetuous shrimp who couldn't speak the language and who struggled to understand? A shudder ran through me. I'd been daydreaming for quite a while, and the bathwater had gone cold. I washed quickly and dried myself ferociously with a large towel, rubbing some warmth back into my body. Once back in my room, I snuggled down in the small bed, my mind empty, ready to drift off to sleep. Small break here in the story. "What do you mean you're not coming?" Florinda strode up and down the flat, clenching and unclenching her fists. We've been given a month's holiday. All expenses paid to visit our family in Italy. And you don't want to come? I shrugged. Florinda came to stand in front of me. It's James, isn't it? He's bewitched you. He'd rather I stayed here with him. He's worried I won't come back. Florinda grabbed me by the shoulders. Of course you're coming back. Did you tell him that? I nodded. Well, tell him again. Or maybe you don't want to see Mama? Of course I do, Florinda, and you know it. I pulled at the ribbon on my blouse. It's just... a month is a long time. Okay. Hi there, Zeebs. Thank you for the raid. That scared the poop out of me. And thank you for the resub. 16 months. Surfman, thank you for the follow and the sub at the same time. Holy buckets. What's up, guys?
It's disgusting. It's so gross.
Absolutely disgusting.
Val, thanks for the biddies.
Oh, someone tried to send a very long message. I don't know who. Or, I don't know who Vixen Trix is. Why the vomit? I don't know. Thanks, my guy. A little late to the party. No worries. We're actually just about to finish a chapter here. So give me like 2 minutes to get through this page, and then you'll have my full attention. Not even 2 minutes. Of course I do, Florinda, and you know it. I pulled at the ribbon on my blouse. It's just... a month is a long time. Look, the man's smitten with you. I've seen the way he dotes on you. He'll wait. Please think about it, Bianca. There's nothing more to think about. I'm staying. James had promised to show me around London yet again, but I wanted to visit the fashion boutiques. That hadn't been possible the first time because Florinda and Ornella had insisted on visiting the other tourist sites, and I couldn't impose trapezing around the shops. Florinda let out a huge sigh. She knew I could be stubborn when I put my mind to it. No way was I going to change my mind, not now. 2 weeks later, with a sullen pull to her face and carrying a heavy case, Florinda left the factory for Italy, accompanied by Ornella.